Here you go. I built this shader tester ball, as I call it. Kind of looks like the one from V-Ray. So basically, you can. It has enough occlusion and details, sharp edges, soft edges, and transitions to see how materials look. So, for example, if we go to the material library, and select glass, edit material, make the bump smaller in scale. This is where you can test how see-through everything is and like what kind of material you're getting. But basically, or like here's the standard metal from Keyshot. Even if with bumped roughness, it looks good. But we can make it better. If we go to miscellaneous, it's basically shaders that are using material graph. We can use them as a base to start something better. For example, rainbow. If you will look at the material graph, it's using this color gradient node that I was talking about before. Infrared. So basically, almost always that means that you can map something to a particular color here. So, but this infrared depends on the angle. So it's camera biased. Matte white, pretty straightforward. Let's see. This is the metal that I used in the gun. Here's a good example. This is my custom metal. This is the metal that I used. It's just my occluded areas were not bronze, but they were just lighter gray. But you can see that it's procedurally picking the occluded areas and assigning it this color. We can obviously change it to anything we want. So it's good to have materials, saves you a lot of time. Let's take a look at how it's set up. Have the what's interesting is this is actually the outcome. So it's supposed to kind of look like this. So metal plugs in from the other side, from one side, and then through occlusion. And that's what's happening here. Let's bring it back to bronze. Somehow it looks a lot more realistic with that. Kind of like old metal. Through occlusion, we plug in a couple of maps, 1 and 2 radius, which controls how far it spreads, and 1 into occluded areas. If we unlink it, you can see that it just disappears. Just some finer control. And basically, once you build this system, you can start expanding and changing it and turning this into plastic. Like this is the final paint material. But we can change that into metal. It will start looking slightly different. I used paint because I wanted my diffuse color to be more rough. So this is a better example. And you can see it just happens that the diffuse is in the middle and the metal is plugged in from the other side. But again, you can always take a screenshot, just copy the layout. You'll get exactly the same thing as long as everything is plugged in the same way. Red metal, even though it's paint, still looks like metal. and you can make slight adjustments in terms of roughness. So how much more reflective it is and stuff. But again, this is how it starts. You just plug in the occlusion, and in the material graph, it's just diffuse and occlusion, and you start plugging in other maps, basically. Or you can just play with color, and that's how you learn what's occluded and what's not. Currently unoccluded looks white. Let's make unoccluded look red. And occluded will look blue. So you can see that, instantly see what areas are affected by the occlusion. And then here, obviously, once you start plugging in maps into occluded and unoccluded, you can change the shape of those occluded areas. So that's pretty much the breakdown for materials. The main takeaway from this is spend some time whenever you're not working or whenever you have free time developing these systems that will help you basically trick the viewer into thinking he's seeing some sort of the material that you want him to see. It's not always as easy as just dropping in metal or dropping in glass. Sometimes you use other materials to build a better glass, to build a better metal. So build those systems, save them into your library, and not only save it here. If you reinstall it, you can also export your materials and just keep them separate. And obviously reuse the materials, reuse the scenes as well. So you can build light setups. Just if you're going through a project where everything needs to be presented in the same way, you will be basically reopening the same scene and then dropping in geometry in there. That way you don't have to spend time setting up everything from scratch, and everything will look the same. So that's important throughout the project. One last thing before we leave Keyshot, I was just gonna mention the render passes. What's important to see here is because we're going into Photoshop now, you can just take a look at YouTube how to use the depth pass to trick, so you don't use the focal points in Keyshot, and you can use the depth pass to adjust the focus of your image. I rarely use that, but sometimes it's useful. Geometric normal pass and clown pass. Normal passes can be used for mapping and for extra textures. Generally, it's just a good idea to have all render passes right away. A lot of times in the format, I do PNG and include transparency so that none of the background information will seep through. Especially if it's glass, it will be kind of semi-transparent. And in terms of rendering options, I would say that more and more I choose to just do maximum time or maximum samples rather than advanced control. Normally, what really influences the render time is amount of samples, amount of ray bounces, and if you have GI, global illumination, depth of field as well. That's if you have those options turned on. So if you choose the lighting presets to product, you get to see this, and you can choose if you had a camera with depth of field, you can also adjust depth of field, but this dramatically increases render time. I rarely touch that. I just usually plug in how long I want this to render and see the result, or just maximum samples. And usually even the maximum samples will give you a slightly better result. But I highly recommend going to the Keyshot forum to get a better understanding of the advanced control, because it's not always best to max out everything, especially like depends on the amount of cores you're using. If your rig is built for Keyshot, sure, you probably don't care. But if you're working on like an i7, you're trying to get the best result in the least amount of time. So definitely the route to go is maximum samples or maximum time. So let's take that rifle and drop it into Photoshop, because the main idea here is that, like I've mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, is that we're not rendering for real time. We don't need UVs. We're only rendering to a specific camera angle, specific static image, and a lot of tricks can be done in Photoshop. A lot of final scratches, all kinds of blemishes, a lot of dirt can be done in Photoshop. A lot more easy, or a lot easier than plugging in maps in Keyshot, because not everything is seamless. Not a lot of seamless maps available. So it's a lot easier to just erase it on the final image, rather than rendering with that map and then getting rid of the seams. So let's take the gun into, I'll render it, and then we'll take that gun into Photoshop.